So today she's going to speak on Commanding Center Stage, Women in American Art Museums Today. Please welcome Rebecca Nagy.
Thank you, Liz, and thank you, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here with this wonderful group of many friends, and I'll say new friends if I don't know you yet. It's an honor to be chosen to speak to you this year and to follow Dean Rosenberry, who spoke last year, who's a wonderful colleague at the University of Florida. It's especially meaningful to me today, not only to honor Susan B. Anthony, but also to honor my mother, whose birthday is today. She would have been 91. She passed away in February. And if you look at the photograph, and you're going to have to look at the screen, not me, because I want you to see, images while I'm sharing them with you. You might wonder, why do I have photographs of two young women looking through microscopes in a talk about art and art museums? Well, the young woman in the background with dark hair is my mother. And that is she when she was in college in the mid-1940s in Savannah, Georgia. She went on to become a high school biology and science teacher and is one of my role models in life, in all aspects of life, along with another relative, an aunt who was a chemistry professor, and a third role model, another aunt who was a high school math teacher. No art people, they were all math and science people. But what my mom and my aunts, and I will also say my father, did for me was, from the time I was, in kindergarten, I had a great love for art, for making art and learning about art. They always encouraged me in that pursuit all the way through my PhD at Chapel Hill. And not only that, my mom and dad always told me, you have academic ability, you need to, do well in school, make good use of the gifts God gave you. And if you do that, we will help you to do anything you want to do and become anything you want to become. So as far as they were concerned, I could have been an astrophysicist, I could have been a brain surgeon. They probably never thought I would be an art museum director. But as that unfolded in my life, they were always there to give me their full support. Another person to whom I want to give a lot of credit was my mentor and sponsor, Larry Wheeler, who, when I was at the North Carolina Museum of Art, he was director there. He still is director there. He's in his 70s. He shows no sign of being interested in retiring. He is fountainhead of energy and enthusiasm in his work. Larry gave me many opportunities to grow and develop professionally at the North Carolina Museum of Art. One day, after I had been there for 17 years, many of those under his leadership as director, he called me to his office and he said, Rebecca, I know you're looking for ways to seek new opportunities, move up in the organization, and right now there's nothing open. I can't see a good place for you to move up right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to push you out of the nest. I said, oh, what do you mean? He said, well, it's not that I want to get rid of you, but I want you to be a colleague. I think you're ready to be a museum director. I had never thought of that ever as a goal. I really had not. And he got me thinking about it, and the other person who really encouraged me to think about that was my husband, Paul, who said, if you get a museum directorship, I'll follow you wherever you go. Don't worry about me, I'll get a job wherever, So fortunately, I was able to apply for the director of the Harn Museum of Art here at the University of Florida. In 2002, we came here, and Paul got a job first at UF. Now he works in Tampa at Hillsborough Community College. And although we miss North Carolina, those of you who know North Carolina, it's a wonderful place. It's hard not to miss Raleigh, but we never regretted moving to Gainesville because we truly love Gainesville, the University of Florida, and being Floridians. Among my fellow art museum directors, there's several who have really been role models for me and inspired me in their careers and their work. So I thought I would show you just a couple of them. One is Kaywin Feldman. Kaywin is the director of the Minneapolis Institute of Arts. It is one of the larger museums in the country with a budget of it's about $35 million budget. Not as big as the Met or the Cleveland Museum of Art, but close. Kaywin moved to Minneapolis from a much smaller museum, the Memphis Brooks Museum in Memphis, Tennessee, which is probably more similar in size to the Harn. She is very honest and open in talking about her search. She really wanted to move to a bigger city and a bigger museum, so she applied for a lot of jobs, and a lot of times she didn't get the job. And she's talked about this and written about this. One of the things that search committees and boards of trustees would actually say to her face was, you cannot be the director of a big museum with a big budget because you're a woman and you lack gravitas. So after she heard that a few times, she decided that gravitas was code for you're not a man. So fortunately, she convinced the board and the search committee at Minneapolis that she did have gravitas and whatever else it takes to run a big museum, and she did get the job, and she's been a leader at the national level and the international level ever since. What I really admire about Kaywin is not only her determination, her ambition, her self-confidence, her persistence in pursuing her goals, but also the fact that she has been a real leader in reaching out to her community, opening up her museum to all kinds of different people in Minneapolis and the region, making everyone feel welcome, and dispelling that old, persistent perception that lingers despite all the work we try to do to overcome it, that museums are elitist and they're only for a certain kind of people or people of certain income or certain education. And we all try to break down those barriers, but Kaywin has been really successful in developing new audiences in Minneapolis. Another role model, Kim Rorschach, had a similar move. Kim's the director of the Seattle Art Museum, which is quite large, maybe $25 million budget, compared to at the Harn, we have about a $4 million budget. So she was at a university museum, the Nasher at Duke, and similar in size to the Harn again. And like Kaywin, she wanted to move to a big city and a bigger museum, and she kept applying, kept applying, kept applying, frequently losing out to male candidates. Not saying it was because of gender, but she didn't let that deter her. She just kept persisting until she got the job in Seattle. But the story I always remember about Kim is at a conference of art museum directors a number of years ago. We were sitting in a room with about 35 women art museum directors. And somebody asked the question, how many of you, when you started out your careers, just out of grad school, had the goal of becoming a museum director? And out of all of us in the room, Kim was the only one who raised her hand. So she had that goal from day one, and she not only achieved it, but has achieved it at a very high level. Some of you will know this woman, I'm sure, or you know her by reputation. If you don't know her, you haven't met her personally, Dr. Jonetta Cole. Jonetta is an anthropologist by academic background, but she's best known for her administrative leadership roles. She was the president of Spelman College in Atlanta for a number of years. She was also president of Bennett College in Greensboro, North Carolina, both historically black women's colleges of very high academic achievement. And she led them brilliantly, but then she made a shift and became an art museum director. And for the last decade or so, she served in an exemplary way as director of the National Museum of African Art at the Smithsonian in Washington, and has really led that museum to new heights of achievement. She just retired, but I know Jonetta well enough to know that she will not rest on her laurels. She will continue to be very active as a leader in our field. What I really learned from Jonetta was that it's not enough to say that you want to promote diversity in your field, but you have to take concrete steps and real action to ensure that diversity is a real, that you can see progress in that area in diversity. So what she did was, when Jonetta became the director of the Smithsonian National Museum of African Art, she joined our rather small and snooty organization called the Association of Art Museum Directors. At that time, we had a cap of 200 members. Getting in is very competitive. Those 200 members included museums in Mexico, the US, and Canada, and only 200 directors were allowed to be members, and you couldn't get in unless somebody retired or passed away, basically. So Jonetta came in, and she said, "This is ridiculous. Look around the room." And we looked around the room, and everybody looked pretty much, with very few exceptions, white. Now, there were, by the time I joined AAMD, a pretty good balance of men and women directors. That had not always been the case, but now it is. But very few people of color, men or women. And Jonetta said, we've got to make some changes. First of all, we've got to loosen up this cap on the number of members. What's the magic number of 200, So right away we raised that to 300, and I think right now we have about 275 members. So it's growing steadily in size. The other thing we had was a cap on budget size. So you had to have a budget of at least $2.5 million. Well, that doesn't sound like that much for an art museum budget, but there were many wonderful museums, such as the museum at Spelman College, doing exemplary exhibitions, publications, building collections, training and mentoring students through internships, doing brilliant work, and they weren't eligible for membership because they didn't have a certain budget. So with Jonetta's leadership and influence, she was on the membership committee, as was I at the time. She said, we've got to get rid of this budget cap. So when we got rid of that, it opened the opportunity for a lot of wonderful new members to apply and join the organization. And one of them who joined soon after that was a longtime friend of mine, Belinda Tate. At the time, Belinda was director of the Diggs Museum at Winston-Salem State University in North Carolina, a small but very high-achieving museum with wonderful exhibitions and leadership and programming. And she and I had worked on a number of projects together in North Carolina, so I was able to be one of her sponsors for membership in AAMD. She since has moved on to Kalamazoo. And this is one of the wonderful things that has happened in AAMD and in the field, and that is that historically, if we saw people of color in leadership positions in museums, whether they were men or women, they were usually in museums with very specific focus. So the African American directors tended to be at museums that focused on African American art. The Latino directors tended to be at museums that focused on Latin American art. Chicano directors, Chicano art. Asian directors, Asian art. And that is slowly beginning to change as we see people in leadership positions in smaller museums now moving up to larger, what we call encyclopedic museums or universal collections that have those areas in which they specialize, but also many other kinds of collections, as is the case at Kalamazoo. So Belinda has moved also to a larger museum with very diverse collections. And one of the things she's been able to do with her background and expertise in African American art is ensure that artists of African American background are also represented in the Kalamazoo collection. So the next phase of my talk is going to be to share a few statistics with you about where we are in representation of women as directors of art museums. And this information comes from a study, The Gender Gap in Art Museum Directorships, that was commissioned about 3 or 4 years ago by the Association of Art Museum Directors. And it focused on directors of those member museums in AAMD in North America. So I have to dodge the balloons to see what it says. So you see that 42.6% of women of directors of AAMD member museums now are women. So it's not half yet, but it's getting close to half, compared to a little bit better percentage of representation among women as the chief executive officers of nonprofits over $1 million in budget in our country or in North America. But look at that last number, and everybody knows this. When you look at the big Fortune 500 or Fortune 1000 companies in North America, a tiny fraction of the leaders of those companies are women. So this is similar to what's happening in art museums. There are more and more women who are directing university art museums and smaller civic museums across North America, but still only a very small percent at the largest museums in North America. Those are still predominantly led by men. We see that beginning to change because now there are more women in the pipeline, just as there are more people of color in the pipeline. And as those people gain experience at museum leadership, they will continue to move up, and we'll begin to see that balance kind of reflect more adequately the balance of our demographics and our population. Women still earn less than men in art museum leadership positions overall, 79% on the dollar. But that is very, very different at the smaller museums versus the larger museums. So again, at museums with budgets under 15 million, women actually make a tiny bit more than men on the average. Yay! So I can relax, I guess I'm doing okay. But at the museums with budgets of over $15 million, the really big city-based museums, women make only 71% on the dollar compared to men. So we still have work to do. We've made a lot of progress, but equity has not been achieved just yet. The last portion of my talk is going to be about art, and particularly about the representation of women in art museums. And I really don't have the statistical studies to give you national averages. So what I can do is focus on what we're doing at the Harn to ensure that women artists are represented in our collections and our exhibitions. And these efforts are certainly reflected in the work of museums across the country, where this is also a concern to ensure that all of the artists in our society are well represented in our collections. So some of you may have seen our Guerrilla Girls exhibition at the Harn during the past year. It's closed now. We'll bring these posters back out sometime again if you miss seeing them. They're really quite fun, and I'll show you a couple of them up close. That banner that you see on the left, "Do women have to be naked to get into the Metropolitan Museum of Art?" is an enlargement of one of the posters. So let me tell you who the Guerrilla Girls are. The Guerrilla Girls is a group of women artists. They formed in New York City in the 1980s. And the reason that they formed their organization, 7 women when they first started, was because they were all working away as artists and not getting much recognition or exposure. And when they went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, or the Modern, or the Guggenheim, or the Whitney, or the major art commercial art galleries in the city, they saw very, very few women artists represented. And they thought this was not right. So they decided to have a guerrilla warfare on this, not physical warfare, but psychological warfare and conceptual warfare. So they started doing interventions and protests and happenings all over the city and in other cities, and they created all these quite clever and witty posters about the underrepresentation of women in the arts, and they plastered them all over New York and other cities, and they got quite a lot of attention. I don't know how much credit we can give to their work, but certainly the situation has improved dramatically, so they must have had a role in making that happen. Now, why the Guerrilla Girls is obvious. They were, kind of guerrilla warriors working behind the scenes, and they wanted to be incognito. Perhaps because they didn't want to harm their own careers by being such strident activist, but also they wanted to focus on the ideas that they were presenting, not on their individual personalities or careers. So they always wore gorilla masks when they did their appearances in public, and then nobody knew who they really were. And each of the Guerrilla Girls assumed the name of a famous woman artist. So just this past year, Dean Lavelli knows that the College of the Arts invited Frida Kahlo, not the Mexican artist Frida Kahlo, but the Guerrilla Girl who calls herself Frida Kahlo, to come and speak at the University of Florida. And we had to move to a bigger auditorium because it was standing room only to hear her speak about the work of the Guerrilla Girls. And they've been active since the 80s. So we had a chance to buy the portfolio of all the posters that they created, and they boxed them up and sold a limited edition of these posters to different museums, and we jumped right on the chance to acquire that portfolio. So we exhibit them as part of our exhibition, Intra-Action, in our contemporary galleries, which focused entirely on the work of women artists in the Harn collection, including the Guerrilla Girls. So here's a man studying one of those posters, and here are some examples. So if I can read this, we saw earlier, do women have to be naked to get into the Met Museum? Less than 4% of the artists in the modern art section of the Met are women, but 76% of the nudes are female. Interesting. So, you know, even to this day, if we show male frontal nudity in the museum, we get some people objecting to that. But if you show female frontal nudity, very few people even say a thing about it, you know? So this isn't right, men, you know? We try to be equal opportunity in our showing nudes. So here is one of my favorite posters. I'm going to need binoculars to read it, but it's so humorous. And one of the things about the Guerrilla Girls, they had very strident, pithy kind of commentary, but they did use a lot of humor to make their points. So some of you can read some of the advantages of being a woman artist, such as working without the pressure of success. Not having to be in shows with men. What else? There's something about, you know, having plenty of time for your 4 part-time jobs. You know, just all kinds of amusing observations that are really things that are quite negative, but they pretended to present them as advantages. So I was very proud of our education department at the Harn, particularly Paige Willis, who's the director of our Bishop Study Center, our interactive learning space at the museum. But she put together this exhibit that you see in the background, and I'll bring you in closer to it in a moment, to kind of build on some of the ideas that the Guerrilla Girls were introducing and give people, when they visited the museum, a chance to make their own observations and consider and reflect on some of these ideas. So here we see 2 teenage girls, Grace and Ivana, responding to a question on the message board there. And it says something like, the Guerrilla Girls argue that women should be better represented in museum exhibitions and collections. Do you agree with this, and why? So a lot of people have written their thoughts on the little post-it notes and put them there on the board, and Grace and Ivana were adding their thoughts, and sometimes I would go in and read those notes, and of course everyone who contributed a note agreed with the Guerrilla Girls, and there were some quite eloquent statements from both male and female respondents to that question. So we decided to bring it close to home and look at our own exhibitions and see what percentage of artists in the exhibitions that we had held at the Harn recently were women. So in the very moving exhibition that some of you may have seen, Aftermath, about the aftermath of wars in the Middle East in which the US has been involved, 75% of the of the artists in that exhibition were women. Interesting high percentage there of women who actually had been in those war situations, documenting them. In our 25th anniversary exhibition, Conversations, a couple of years ago, only a quarter of the artists were women. Well, that's not surprising because that exhibition drew from the entire history of art, from all of our collections, Asian, African, modern, contemporary photography from across many, many centuries. And when we go back to earlier centuries in the history of art, women artists are less well represented than they are among contemporary artists. So still a quarter of the artists in the show were women, which I think is somewhat respectable. Similarly with Framing Nature, an exhibition about art and nature, about a quarter were women. The Japanese ceramics, contemporary Japanese ceramics, about a third were women. And then, not surprisingly, a wonderful exhibition about contemporary haute couture fashion design in Ghana. 77% of the fashion designers we showed were women. And there's how the women stack up percentage-wise in some of our collections. The pink bars represent women artists and the black bars represent men. You see we've still got a long way to go for parity, but we're doing pretty well in photography and contemporary, where both of the curators are women and they are working very hard to ensure that women are represented alongside their male colleagues. Whoops, oh yeah. Okay, you can't read these, but I think it's just impressive to see the list. These are women artists in the Harn collection. So those are the names of all the women that can be identified. You know, some of the artists, if they did African textiles or beadwork, we may not know the name of the artist, and we may not be certain if the artist was male or female in some instances, in some of the earlier periods of art. But these are artists whom we know by name, women in the Harn collection, and the ones that were listed in pink were the ones who were on view in the museum at that particular time when the exhibit was up. Some museums focus on women artists exclusively, and I'm sure that many of you have been to the National Museum of Women in the Arts in DC. It's not on the mall, but it's not far off the mall. If you haven't visited it, it's certainly a museum that's worth visiting and you would enjoy visiting. And the founders of that museum, including Wilhelmina Cole Holliday on the right, felt at the time, 30 years ago, that women were not being represented in art museums as much as they should be. And so it would be necessary to devote a museum exclusively to women artists in order to make sure that they got more recognition that was deserved. So that museum has played a very important role in bringing attention to women artists, and now happily we're beginning to see that have a broader impact in more general museums where women are better represented. Another place where you can really celebrate the work of women artists, particularly feminist artists, is in a new wing of the Brooklyn Museum in New York, the Elizabeth A. Sackler Center for Feminist Art. And there is a centerpiece, long-term, quasi-permanent installation of The Dinner Party by Judy Chicago. How many of you have seen The Dinner Party? Good, I thought a lot of you would have. So you should go to Brooklyn when you're in New York City. It's subway right away. And there's a subway stop right by the entrance to the museum. And you can see a lot of wonderful things there, including this Center for Feminist Art and Judy Chicago's dinner table, where each place setting is devoted to a different woman artist. So the table linens and the plates and goblets all relate to the style and career of those different women artists. So what about women artists in the Harn? I thought I would end by showing you a few of the outstanding artists that we have in our collection, just a handful because there's so many. You'll have to come and see them for yourselves. But I was reminiscing with Donna earlier about when we were taking art history in college, and this for me was in the 70s. And we had these big art history survey books by Jansen or Gardner. How many women artists were in the book, Donna? None. None. Can you believe that? None. It's insane. So, and in 1971, an art historian named Lucy Lippard, very famous art historian, wrote an essay for Art News called "Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists?" I reread that essay recently, and I was startled to read again what she said, which was, there have been no great women artists. She said that in 1971. I find that rather shocking. I would love to debate that with her. But she said, there have been some very good women artists. And there have been many good women artists. But she was thinking about Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo and Bernini, and she couldn't think of any women artists who rose quite to that level. Not even, you know, Artemisia Gentileschi or Sophonisba Anguissola or Mary Cassatt or Berthe Morisot or Georgia O'Keeffe or Louise Nevelson. Very good artists, but she didn't think they rose to the same level as the greatest men. So that would be an interesting thing to debate. But the point that she really wanted to make was not that these women weren't as great as certain male artists, but that the reason that there weren't more very good and great women artists is because women had been denied the opportunities that men had, which is obvious, really, but she gave example after example. Could they get into the art academy? Usually not. If they did get into the art academy, were they allowed to participate in the life drawing classes with male nude models or even female nude models? No. and back in the day when the best way that you trained to be a history painter or a painter of religious subjects or portraits was by learning to paint the nude body first, then you put the clothes on it later. Women didn't have that opportunity to study anatomy, to study the poses and foreshortening and all the things that you have to learn to be able to portray figures well. So those are just examples. Of course, women were not encouraged for the most part by their families, their fathers and mothers, their husbands, to pursue careers. They didn't have the opportunities that men had. So that was the argument that she really wanted to make. And certainly those textbooks that we had in college tended to reinforce those terrible ideas that there weren't interesting women artists. And at the time, I think if people could have named one or two women artists, Georgia O'Keeffe would have been one of the ones that virtually everyone could name. And certainly she's still an artist that most people have heard of and can picture some of her works. So we have one wonderful Georgia O'Keeffe painting in the Harn. If you haven't seen it, you'll have to look in our modern gallery. And it's not one of her great big flower paintings, of which she's perhaps, you know, for which she's best known. It's a small flower painting because she also did a whole series of very intimate, more miniature flower paintings, such as our Austrian Copper Rose. So that is our wonderful Georgia O'Keeffe. We used our Audrey Flack, Islandia, Goddess of the Healing Waters, on the announcement and the program for today's event. Audrey Flack, still active as an artist, has kind of celebrated women in mythological roles in antiquity, goddesses and mythological heroes, as a way of celebrating the strength and courage and inspiring aspects of women's lives. So here you have a figure who looks very much like the winged victory of Samothrace, partially nude figure with her wings, raising her arms in a gesture of healing. And she does make her sculptures beautifully polychromed, as we say, with gold and different colors, to remind us that in Greek and Roman antiquity, those beautiful marble statues were not white. They painted them and gilded them with a lot of rich gold and color. So she uses that in her beautiful mythologically inspired sculptures as well. This was in our recent exhibition of work by women artists in the contemporary galleries. It has since changed to a new exhibition, so you'll have to look for Islandia a little later. I wanted to tell you about new works that we've added to the collection. These are by a young Ghanaian artist named Priscilla Kennedy. Priscilla is a master's student at one of the leading art schools in West Africa. It's in Kumasi, Ghana. KNUST, the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology. I've been doing some research there. I just got back from my second trip to Ghana in the last 2 years. And in Ghana, our curator of African art, Susan Cooksey, and I have discovered that there are many, many artists who are doing extremely interesting work, both men and women, and many of them are gaining recognition nationally and internationally, not only in Ghana, but throughout Africa, Europe, and the US and beyond for their work. And Priscilla, we think, is one of these up-and-coming young artists that we want to acquire her work while we can. So we bought 4 from this series. Now what she did in this series was she went to the Muslim neighborhood of Kumasi, and this is in a part of Ghana that's majority Christian, but there are Muslim neighborhoods. So she went there and she bought these keffiyeh, the Arab men's headscarves. So that's what these are embroidered on. Then she created her designs of women, celebrating women's sexuality, physicality, erotic desires, and she then took these drawings that she had done on the keffiyeh back to the Muslim neighborhood, where she found Muslim embroiderers, who are men, and she commissioned them to embroider these designs on the keffiyeh. So when she told us about this, we said, oh wow, Priscilla, that's pretty daring. What did these men think when they embroidered these designs? And she said, well, they liked them. And they didn't seem to have a problem with it. So one of the things that we found in Ghana, and I think this might be true in the US as well, there's another interesting artist whom we've been working with in Ghana who's, his gender identity is fluid. He says he's male biologically, but no particular gender in his life, you know, in his practice of his life. So he frequently dresses in female attire. And I asked him, you know, aren't you afraid to be so open about your gender bending lifestyle in a very conservative country like Ghana? And he said, well, I am. I sometimes run into people who are very threatened by that or aggressively opposed to that. But when I tell them I'm an artist, they go, oh, you're an artist. It's okay. So I think people expect artists to be a little bit out there and do things that are a little more experimental. And Priscilla is able to work with these Muslim embroiderers without them getting too upset with her. But in particular, I think this embroidery on the right is very telling of how she is questioning attitudes of the male patriarchy in Muslim culture and to a certain extent in Jewish and Christian culture, where in some very conservative groups, women are told they shouldn't cut their hair, or they should always cover their hair. So here she's got a woman who's just, you know, showing her hair and cutting her own hair and kind of objecting to being told what she can or can't do with her body. So I will also say that that image on the right that's now in the Harn collection was purchased for us by my mother-in-law, who wanted to help us acquire some more work from artists in Ghana. So the last thing I want to mention, just in keeping with the topic today of women in art museums, is that our upcoming major exhibition at the Harn, which opens on October 6th to the public, it's all about roles of women in the Enlightenment era in France. It's called Becoming a Woman in the Age of Enlightenment, which is mainly the 18th century, somewhat into the early 19th century, all drawn from one of the greatest collections of French art in our country. It belongs to a couple in Massachusetts, Jeffrey and Carol Horvitz, who are patrons of the Harn and members of our National Advisory Council. So they're lending us these wonderful 120 works from their collection. They're not all by women artists. Some are, others are by Boucher and Fragonard and some of the famous French male artists of that era. But they all have to do with the lives of women during this period. The curator is Melissa Hyde, who's a professor of art history in our College of the Arts and a scholar and expert on 18th century French art. So not only is the art spectacularly beautiful, luscious colors and, gorgeous costumes that these women wear and, beautiful landscapes, just a feast for the eyes. But it's also very thought-provoking because thematically, Melissa is looking at how were women educated in 18th century France? What career opportunities were open to them? What were their courtships and romances like? What was married life like for them and family life? What was child rearing like? How did they teach their own daughters to be successful in that society at that time? What kind of clothing did they wear? What were their leisure activities? What books did they read? So just a wonderful, comprehensive view of the life of women in that era in France. So I encourage you to come and enjoy that exhibition this fall. The member party opening celebration will be on Thursday night, October 5th. And I'll put in this one plug. I know many of you are members of the Harn. If you're not, you can join for free. Membership in the museum is free. All you have to do is go online or stop by the museum and sign up to be a member. And then you get to come to our great parties. And you get lots of other benefits as well of being a member. So I look forward to seeing many of you on Thursday evening, October 5th for the opening party, and certainly during the run of this exhibition to enjoy the thought-provoking and beautiful art that you'll see there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca Nagy. And she does get a mug. It's called Generation of Women, Moving History Forward.